Hi everybody, this is HdE. Some folks tagged me on Twitter a couple of days ago with 7 questions about the 1990s, which seemed to me to be a really cool, fun thing to be doing at the moment. Seems like a nice way of sort of getting to know people and finding out what makes them tick. So I thought what I'd do is just quickly record some answers to video camera and share them with all of you guys. So here we go. Really good question. Folks who've been following me for some time on social media will probably be aware that I'm a lifelong fan of anime, and I actually used to write for websites about anime, used to make YouTube videos about it as well. And really that's kind of, they're the only kind of cartoons, if you want to call them that I can really take these days. I don't really get on too well with westernized cartoons so much. But you know, no slight on anybody who enjoys those, they're just not my bag. So the only cartoons I really own on DVD or Blu-ray are those kinds of things, really. When I think about cartoons from the 90s, it's kind of tricky because, you know, I want to say that my favourite cartoon from that era that I own is Dominion Tank Police. But when you look at when it was made, it's more 80s than 90s, you know, albeit late 80s. So I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say that my favourite cartoon from the 90s that I own on DVD is this, New Dominion Tank Police, which is not quite as good as far as I'm concerned, but it's still got that good Dominion Tank Police vibe about it. It's still lots of fun, and I find it quite a charming little show. So that's my answer for that one. Fun show. That's a really easy one. The answer for me is Sega, and that's because of my old man. Now there's a bit of a story attached here which I have told on social media before, but it doesn't really hurt to share it again. But basically it goes like this. When I was about 13 years old, my mother abruptly walked out on me and my father, and this left us in a very difficult position. My father and I were left living in the family home, which was a 3-bedroom bungalow in Devon. And you know, things very quickly became uncomfortable. You know, I think my father was finding it a struggle to bring the money in that we needed to stay there, and we also had a very difficult relative on my mother's side to deal with as well. And to cut a very long story short, what happened after a while was that we actually ended up moving in with my grandparents on my father's side. So we had very, very little at all. Now this was a very difficult time for me as a kid growing up, because I was obviously a year or two into secondary school by this point. And a lot of the kids that I went to school with were pretty nasty pieces of work. So I was kind of going to school every day and keeping my head down and just doing my work and just trying to get out of the days unscathed. And I came home from school one day and my dad had gone out and bought me a Sega Mega Drive. And it was just there, and he said, "Here you go." And I think I'd mentioned to him that I'd seen them and that they looked like cool things and that I would maybe like to have one. But the fact that he had gone out and gone to that expense to buy me that thing, that really blew me away at the time. And I remember having a lot of, you know, fun times of just sitting playing on that thing. And for the longest time, all I had to play on it was Altered Beast, which is not a game I even particularly like. But it was just so great to be able to play this thing that my father had bought for me, and I will never forget that. Thanks, Dad. My favourite console game from the 90s would be Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo, for a few reasons. I mean, besides the fact that it was an absolutely amazing arcade conversion and it packed in so much of what was in the original machine, it was just a really good, really deep one-on-one fighting game. And I've got a lot of fun memories of playing that game with other people. You know, I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, but you know, there were 1 or 2 people that I could play that with, you know, for long sessions. And you know, I just loved the fact that there was this whole aspect of it that you had to practice to get good at it. And even if you only played it as a single player game, you know, there was still an awful lot to get your head round in terms of mechanics. I always liked the whole thing of having different strengths of punches and kicks, and you know, I like the fact that there were all the counter attacks and special tricks that you could use. And I loved the way that there was such a sense of reward that you got for learning how to play all the different characters' movesets and everything. There was an absolutely astronomical amount of play in that game, and I think I spent more time on that on my Super Nintendo than I did with any other game. And that's saying something, because I invested quite some hours into F-Zero, as I remember. That's a really interesting question. Again, if people have been following me on social media for any length of time, they're probably aware that I actually work freelance in comics. And you know, comics have kind of been like a feature in my life since childhood, to different degrees, off and on over the years. In the 90s though, I wasn't really reading comics. I think the only one that really sticks in my mind, which was a big deal, was actually an anthology magazine that Dark Horse Comics put out called Manga Mania. And that really capitalized on the whole early 90s thing of like Japanese animated features and short series being brought over to the West. It was kind of a big deal because it was another way of getting that fix of Japanese pop culture, for kids like me who had just sort of suddenly got hold of this stuff, or suddenly it had become much more easy to obtain. And it was a big deal because there was an aspect of it that some of the stuff that came over to the West in the early 90s, because of the UK film classification system, there was some stuff that we just couldn't legally get hold of. So having stuff in print meant that we had another avenue to sort of get our hands on things, and maybe we could even see a little glimpse of what was going on with those things that we couldn't get our hands on until a few years later. Manga Mania was really great because what it was doing each issue was serializing one chunk of an ongoing story, several times over. So you would get, I think they were the first, I think maybe even the only UK magazine to serialize the original Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo. But you also had stuff like Masamune Shirow's Appleseed was in there. There were some serialized Godzilla comics. Sometimes a few other things would creep in here and there. And the magazine was full of stuff that gave you a glimpse into all kinds of like fun, geeky Japanese pop culture things. And I really wish I still had my issues of that, because it was a great little magazine. I can't answer that one because I've never been into wrestling. I've never even paid any attention to it, so can't help you on that one. Sorry. This is a tricky question because in the 90s I wasn't really paying attention to music. I didn't really become interested in music in any capacity until I think maybe the extremely late tail end of the 90s, which would be when I started playing music, because I did invest 10 years of my life in that, sort of trying to pursue that semi-seriously, and that went nowhere. But before that I wasn't really paying much attention at all. And if I think now in terms of the music that I listen to these days that stayed with me over the years, and if I think back to where some of those bands would have been in the 90s and what they were doing, there are a couple of things that jump out. My favourite song is not a particularly well-known one at all, but it's actually an album track. It's actually the album opener from this album, Afraid of Sunlight by Marillion. Now Marillion are not a particularly well-known band, but they do have a very loyal fan base. I know this is Mr. Biffo's favourite band, so there's that. But the opening track on this album is a really special piece of music. It's a really cleverly crafted song as well. Marillion are absolutely brilliant musicians, and they've done a lot of really interesting stuff. This is actually one of my favourite albums of all time, and there's a lot of reasons why I like it. But the title track, Gazpacho, which is my favourite song, I think that's a really interesting piece of music. It's a really well-written song. It's all about the pressure of fame and how it kind of causes people to self-destruct and take it out on people that are close to them. There's a lot of layers to it, and musically it's very, very interesting as well. It's got lots of lovely chiming guitars. There's a real in-your-face Pete Travis bass line that really carries the whole song. And there's a fantastic intro as well. It's got some really lovely, some really lovely jammy guitars on it, and it just sort of sets the whole tone for an album that just has got just a ton of really good stuff in it. And you know, it's a shame that more people don't know it really. I think I have heard Gazpacho played on radio stations a few times, and you know, that's good. I think more people should hear it because it's great. My favourite music video is a difficult one because I've never really paid a lot of attention to music videos. They always sort of strike me as just being glorified adverts for singles and stuff. They're sort of there to make kids run out and buy music. So I don't really have many favourites. But one that has always stuck in my mind from the 90s is actually the video for a single from the Rush album, Counterparts, which is, again, really great album. But there's a song on here called Stick It Out, which, to give you an insight into what's going on in the video on that, there's a funny story about how the band's guitarist, Alex Lifeson, at a concert, stepped up to the mic and introduced the next song, saying, "This is a song about a guy tied to a chair on top of a pole." And that's accurate. That's an easy question, just because I wasn't really watching an awful lot of TV in the 90s. But of the things that I was watching, the one that sticks in my mind is Twin Peaks, because that was, well, if you've seen it, you know why. There was nothing like it on TV at the time. And I really liked that because it had, you know, a lot of quirkiness, and it was very off the wall. And that whole show had a lot of personality. I think the reason Twin Peaks sticks in my mind is just that, you know, apart from the fact that it had this whole sense of weirdness shot all the way through it, which I really loved, it was quite a clever show in the way that it went about getting you invested in the characters and, you know, the situations, the scenarios and everything that was going on. And if I had to pick out one favourite episode, I think the obvious one to go for would be the final episode of the second season, because you know, the show was cancelled. It devolved into something of like an offbeat soap opera, and it really wasn't as good as it had been by that point. So it was cancelled, and there was just enough time to give it some kind of wrap up and a kind of a definitive ending. And the show, I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it because it is worth a watch, but the show does have a punch in the gut ending, and that didn't sit right with me. It was kind of good, but it just wasn't what I wanted. And it, you know, considering I'd been following this thing on TV every week for God knows how long, it just left a bad taste in my mouth. If I had to single out one particular episode in that show as a standout point though, I think that would be the episode where the underlying mystery of the entire show was actually solved, because that was a very brave thing for the show to do. What you've got to bear in mind is that the whole show was built around this premise of a murder investigation, and there were loads of threads to this that were being like unpicked as the show went on during its first series. So when the show actually got to a point where that question was answered and the murderer was revealed, I actually thought that was done in a very, very stylish, very satisfying way. And it was very clever as well, in that it was done in such a way that it left viewers with more questions, even though they'd been given satisfying answers. And what was interesting to me about that was the whole feeling of like, you know, where do they go from here? And unfortunately, where they went from there was soap opera. So it doesn't really surprise me that the show got canned. It's a shame, because I've always thought that Twin Peaks is one of the most characterful TV shows that's ever been made. And in a way, I'm actually kind of sad that they went ahead and made a third season, even though they did some interesting things in that. And I haven't seen it, but I've kept up with chatter on it, so I broadly know what happens. And I don't know whether I can be bothered to watch it. But I've got lots of fond memories of Twin Peaks, and that was probably my favourite TV show as a kid growing up. Okay, so those are my answers to 7 questions about the 1990s. I hope they weren't too boring. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this, and I hope you'll all stay safe out there. Catch you later.